So Megan and I are part of a health psychology forum that sends random emails and people ask for help about random things. And this article popped up and on that forum, and I thought, oh, this is actually very interesting because from experience of having tried Atlas TI, I thought maybe it was just, I didn't know what I was doing because I didn't like it. I really struggled with it. And then when I saw this article, I thought, well, oh, okay, maybe there's something here that we need to engage with in terms of how we use these softwares. So I've tried Atlas. Siobhan, I think you've tried Deduce. Am I right?
Yeah, Charmaine and I have been using Deduce for the analysis of the interviews for her research. And
yes,
I mean, I've not done it without software, so I'm learning it, the analysis for the first time on software. And it works quite well. Like, as far as we haven't had any problems with it, really.
That's good to know. Yeah, I mean, my issue with Atlas was just that I found I was losing the bigger picture. I was getting so buried in the details of coding and numbers around coding as well. Which
I've had training in Vivo.
Okay. That's very interesting. Yeah. So, I think it's pros and cons. Sorry, Megan, did you want to add?
No, I'm saying I think it's useful in terms of like sorting stuff. But I think, like you say, you can get quite lost in the minutiae.
Absolutely, yeah.
I tried using it.
Which one did you try?
In Vivo.
Okay.
Because I thought, I'll be submitting to journals and they'll probably want you to have used a certain software. That's just wasting my time.
Yeah, you see, so there are issues. Yeah, so anyway, let's delve into this article and see if it can help us a bit, because when I was reading through it, I thought, yeah, okay, yay, this makes sense. And it's got a whole lot of potential elephant traps that we need to think about when we engage with software. So I don't think we should throw it out completely, but definitely going in with eyes wide open. So this is an article by Zhao on QD, what do they call it? QDAS, so Qualitative Data Analysis Software. And I agree, Santo, I think there is this perception, certainly with certain journals, that like software is a more rigorous option, or you feel like doing pen and paper is not enough. Yeah, so I've certainly thought about that as well sometimes and felt that pressure. Okay, so QDAS typically includes in Vivo, Deduce, Atlas, anything that you're using to try and help you analyze qualitatively. Rona, do you want to share slides here? Come and sit and have it. Sit down.
Anyway.
Okay. I don't know if I added you to it. I've been a bit snoozy this morning and realized I didn't add people and added Siobhan and then
it was my
no. So ostensibly QDAS is used to make analysis more efficient. But there's actually very little literature that examines the effects of using it on the validity of data analysis. So this whole issue of validity is very central to this article. And I think what's interesting is that the literature typically treats it as methodologically neutral. And the discussions of it in the literature are very technical or very theoretical, and they're not around the methodology of it and how we integrate it into the way that we're doing things. So this was a fresh perspective, but it aligned very much with the experience I'd had and perhaps also with what you'd experienced as well, Santo. So there's this naturalistic trust and these assumptions that QDAS is a good option. It's viewed as intrinsically trustworthy. It's viewed as something that's going to improve efficiency. It's going to be quicker. It's going to help you. It's going to help to get more consistent data analysis because you're interrogating data faster and more precisely. These are the kinds of claims and assumptions that these programs and these software developers are making. They're also saying you can then keep an audit trail for transparency. Also that you can work across a team. So multiple team members can be working on the same data. And Siobhan, I think you've had that experience. So different people working on the same data set. So it's seen as something that adds rigor, that it's kind of based on statistical rules, and it gives us this very strict kind of analysis done in a rigorous way, and that helps with generalization.
Like AI, just taking out the human elements of analysis.
Yeah,
They use the word bias because, you know, it removes bias.
I don't know if they've said that, but quite possibly. I
Because
think
for me, this means bias. And I know, Siobhan, you made such an interesting comment at one of the journal clubs when you said, you know, you assume that statistics are not biased. And actually, they are.
Well, there's an element of subjectivity in statistics.
Yeah.
And certainly we found that with other projects. That what you choose to do in terms of your statistics can be quite subjective, and you can get different opinions on that.
Yeah. Is this not biased? You know?
I think what the software seems to do is to make it easier to do a kind of statistical analysis, because it can count up in your data set like how many times a certain code appears, and it does that really quickly. So that makes it easier to do some kind of statistical analysis if you wanted to, but it doesn't change the fact that, like, whatever question you're asking or how you frame the question or how you analyze those things could be biased still. It's still dependent on the user.
Absolutely. I think the other thing that's problematic for me with all these numbers that come in is that there's this concept of intercoder reliability. So some people who look at thematic analysis say, okay, now you must get someone else to analyze it, and then you check the intercoder reliability. And Braun and Clark actually say, absolutely not. We should not be doing that. We should not be bringing stats in here. That's not the essence of what qualitative research is. I think my response from experience is it depends on the type of project. So sometimes it's useful to see the saturation in terms of how many particular codes are coming, or what particular codes are coming out more frequently than others. But I think that heart of qualitative research is not around numbers. Yeah.
But you know, Jennifer, it was that earlier paper that you did about how do you define a theme? And, you know, the paper said you have to go minute. You know, you mustn't have
More
these
detailed.
broad categorizers.
Like
and I
string.
still, yes, and I still fight against that, because I think that, you know, where something like this goes wrong, for example, you are looking at what people got out of an experience. Now, if you say friendship, friends, brotherhood, connection, you would get 4 different codes. And, you know, they're not, I really do believe that that's what gets lost, is it becomes so trees, you haven't got a wood, you know,
Well,
and there's just like all these little trees that you actually, and I think that that's what you have to do with research, is you have to see patterns. And I think that this takes away that patterning that I think we as humans are uniquely capable of doing.
And I think you can still do that. Like with Charmaine's projects, what we've done is we've like done all these codes, and then we've had these meetings where we discuss, okay, we've got these codes, and which codes actually need to be grouped together, or, you know, which codes actually are the same thing, that we've coded it as something different. Maybe she coded it using one word and I coded it using another word, or even, you know, there were like 2 instances where we coded it with this particular word, and there were 3 instances where we coded it with this word. But actually, when we look at it in terms of the research question, it's the same concept, right? And then we've had like several meetings of like going through the tables of the codes and discussing which ones, and discussing the examples and which ones are actually the same thing. So like having friends and friendship, we'd probably say, okay, in terms of what we're saying in this question, it depends on what the question is and what the question is asking, but those things would probably then we'd say, okay, that's the same code. We're going to put that together as one code.
Yeah, no, and absolutely, that's the job of the analyst, to try and make sense of all these codes, to group them logically, and then to lead, almost take the reader's hand and lead them through your analysis in a way that makes sense. I think the issue is when we start getting into numbers and stats and intercoder reliability and those kind of things, where it can veer too far towards a quantitative aspect, or you get so bogged down in the numbers that you're losing the picture of the whole, the whole picture, and what are you seeing? Yeah, exactly. So it's that constant moving between the minutiae and the bigger picture. So we've got a couple of buts here in terms of those assumptions on the previous page. So researchers seldom fully unpack the assumptions underlying terms like rigor, inter-rater reliability. We don't actually explain what we mean or what we understand those to mean in particular or in relation to the particular project. And I think these authors point out very importantly that using this kind of software can actually shape the lens through which you view your data. So the rigidity of the system and the way that the system works in terms of analyzing forces you to look at it in a particular way, versus if you did something different with pen and paper or whatever it is. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. And certainly my experience has been getting sucked into over detailed coding. So getting stuck in the details and not seeing the data as a whole in the bigger picture. So that's, I think, just warnings if you are going to use QDAS, that the system actually forces you to look at things through a particular lens. And so it can actually be a bit restrictive if you're not aware of how you're using it, what you're trying to achieve, what kind of project you're dealing with. Yeah.
Can I ask about that? Because as I said at the beginning, I haven't done qualitative analysis without software. So it's difficult for me to understand this or to see what that feels like or what that looks like.
Yeah.
Could you maybe explain it a bit more, because I don't understand.
Okay, so from experience, I think, and anybody else, please chip in here. I think it depends largely on the type of data in the project itself. So sometimes you're going to be dealing with data that's quite straightforward. So for example, I did a project with Zhao and Neil years ago with rural pracs, and we did a survey before and after the prac, a qualitative survey with students about their experiences and what they anticipated was going to happen versus what actually happened. And the responses were fairly superficial. Or, for example, some of the interviews we do with patients around after an interaction with a health professional. So, how did it go? How was your communication? It's really superficial stuff. Versus another study where you're delving into deep experiences that people are having. So even the kind of data that Sonto's dealing with, where it's experiences of mental health, delving into complexities and context in quite a detailed way, you're going to do different things. So sometimes I've used big sheets of paper, and Claire used to love big blackboard or a big spidograms, or sometimes we've done little sticky notes in different colors on big pieces of paper. Sometimes I've done on the computer and then refined, so I'll have different sets of documents kind of going from broad, so starting off with the interview that's transcribed, making notes and codes, then transferring those into another document, kind of pulling together. Sometimes I'll also look at saturation in terms of pulling out how many quotes I'm getting on a particular topic, just to get a sense of how much. And I think we did that, Sonto, with that mental health project. We did use some numbers just because we were dealing with 400 and whatever responses.
Yes.
From a qualitative survey. It was huge. Yeah. So we had to use numbers there to give us a sense of how many and where we were going.
We call them tallies.
Tallies, yeah. Yes, so yes. She kind of added up just to get a loose idea of, okay, stress is coming out, stress-related issues are coming out a lot. Whereas you wouldn't do that so the follow-up study to that mental health one with healthcare workers was a psych master student did interviews with, I think, 11 healthcare workers. Then she didn't need to do that kind of approach. Then she sat with pen and paper, just going through coding and then starting to organize the codes into themes and kind of working around what works best with the organization of things.
Do something similar to you, honey, as well. I tend to use either tables in Word or Excel sheets.
Yes.
Yeah.
And go across the interview and also start writing down, like, what am I seeing across the interviews, like what's coming up, what's unique in each interview.
Absolutely, yeah. So and Siobhan,
But
I
we're
can
doing
send
that
you.
anyway.
Laborious. It takes time.
I think
yeah, but it's
is that like we're doing something similar to that in like a lot of what you've described. We seem to, like Charmaine and I seem to be going through a similar process. Like we're doing
Good.
Like one of the things that's helpful is like you can export an Excel spreadsheet of your codes from Deduce. So you don't have to go through and make the whole Excel spreadsheet. So that's faster. But then you're still going through, we're still manually sitting and discussing it together and going through the Excel spreadsheet and thinking about what it means and where does it crop up and what are the, and then things like finding the quote that's linked to a code is quite easy, because then, you go in the software and you just click on it and it'll bring up all the, and then we can say, okay, look at this quote and this quote and this quote, and what do they actually mean in the context of the question. But like concretely, the steps that we're taking are much the same as what you've described. I suppose like maybe the bias comes in for when you're talking about students and they have like quite a shallow interpretation.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't go further than that. They just do the codes and then they're like, there's codes, the end.
Yeah, exactly. So that, I think there's always this need to move between the bigger picture and the smaller details. On a project recently, just talking about Excel spreadsheets. So Johanni and I have been working on a family medicine project that involved observations of recorded role plays that medical students have done. And then we were analyzing them similarly to that telepractice study where we had loads of codes and sort of loose themes and things coming through in Excel spreadsheets. And Johanni and I really struggled to make sense of it. And in the end, I remember writing out the themes that Johanni had come up with and cutting them all out and putting the strips of paper on a table and moving them around until I was happy with the organization. So because I couldn't do that with the spreadsheets that she'd done. So I think, there's like multiple steps that you're going to have to take and find ways to, whatever works, I think, to see that bigger picture and to do that organization. Yeah.
And I think our brains do look for patterns.
We do. And that's what we are doing here. Yes.
And I think sometimes we almost feel a little bit embarrassed about that, that we try and write up our methodology like that's not what we did, because we feel it's not rigorous, it's biased, etc., etc.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think that we have to acknowledge that's a uniquely human thing, that you actually want to see how things group together.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Turn a pink.
Yeah. And I thought about it, and the thing that jumped out, that's actually what you're doing is it's jumping out.
Absolutely. I was just remembering.
But you never write it up like that.
I was remembering that it was years ago we had a research assistant doing thematic analysis, I think, on some of the drama project, that diabetes project. And I remember she submitted a huge document, an Excel spreadsheet, and she must have had about 20 different colors. And I remember opening this thing and scrolling through, and I just closed it again. Like, I don't know what this is. This is just too complex. And obviously in her mind it worked, but it didn't work for me as another team member to try and
like
figure
pink
out.
and dark pink.
It was just too much. So I think one just has to be very careful. And I guess maybe you need to think also about, does the particular software actually work for what I need? Because every software is a bit different as well.
It goes like back to reflective practice as well, because I think
absolutely
the software is definitely useful in terms of helping categorize, and like Siobhan said, being able to click on something and all your themes or all your quotes are there. And so it definitely helps organize things.
Yes.
But I do think you need to look at it again and say, am I happy with how this has been categorized? And not just assume that, like, just take the categories at face value in terms of how they've been sorted. Like, you need to look through all of it again and be like, am I satisfied that this quote has been categorized under this theme?
Yeah.
Or Yeah,
and that I haven't missed this
Absolutely.
key theme.
Yes,
That's
actually, I
the
don't
other thing.
agree. I don't agree with this. I actually think it fits better under this theme.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I think you have to, like, there has to be that human element of interpretation. There has to be almost like a secondary analysis on the software analysis, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so there's also two issues with the software. So traditionally, the software was there as a tool and it wouldn't do the analysis for you. Now we've got AI. So in Vivo and Atlas TI actually have AI functions, so it'll do it all for you. And there, yeah, I agree, there's a big trap. I think regardless of whether you're using the AI function or not in the software, I think you still need to have that kind of off computer, off software, on a piece of paper, in a room, discussing together kind of approach to check and to make sure that what you're doing is on the right track.
Because I mean, I think that, I mean, there's, especially now with AI, and that there's been this big argument as to, no, it's something that shouldn't be touched.
Yeah.
Versus like, you can't just live in like the dark ages. You actually have to start using these softwares and like new techs and that. But I think for me, I think it has to be a blend of the two. Like,
for sure. Yeah.
You can't ignore the way things are moving, but you also can't let go of some of the old traditional methods, because there is value in those methods.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. You know, some of these AI tools are potentially helpful if you're using them with eyes wide open and you know exactly what you're using them for and how they might help you. Yeah.
You know, I'm just reminded of an accountant who once said to us in the context of a school governing body, he said, be very aware of people who offer you things for free. He said it is such a trap.
Yeah.
Because you put your trust and your belief in that, and then you shut down other avenues. And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't deliver what it promises. And I can't help thinking that this is actually what happens a bit with AI.
Yeah.
It's so seductive because, oh my goodness, an analysis that would take me months, I can do in 2 minutes.
So quick, yeah.
And
so tempting.
this is going to change my life. And the hope and excitement is actually never really realized. And I think that
exactly.
your point that you have to understand that it's a tool and it's not necessarily going to save you time, I think would go a long way to actually solving a lot of the problems that we're having with it.
Absolutely, yeah. I think what was also interesting, I came across this other article which talks about, so what they did was a Twitter analysis of tweets, and they used 4 different QDAS tools. And there were differences in terms of how they were analyzing and what came out the other end.
That's very interesting.
Which was interesting to me as well. And what they recommend, I'll talk about it a little bit later, is different types of programs depending on what you're wanting to do with data and the type of data you're working with.
But you know, I mean, if 4 different people analyze Twitter, you'd get different results as well. So, you know, hey, that's kind of comforting.
Because it's just subjectivity.
That it's not necessarily
bias-free.
Bias-free, objective.
It has subjectivity.
Not the truth.
But there is still subjectivity and there is still bias.
Yeah, and I guess that's the heart of qualitative research as well, is that there's subjectivity because the analyst crafts an interpretation.
But isn't that like such a, I mean, to me that seems, as coming from quantitative, that's like one of the draws about qualitative, is that you really get to interact with your data, and you really, you know, like I feel like almost people who are drawn to QDAS because they're like, okay, now I can do this in 5 minutes and I don't have to interact with the data much. Maybe they shouldn't be qualitative researchers. Like maybe that's not really where, because I feel like you should have this interest in your data, that you want to read it and think about it and stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I was interested. So recently I had supper and I had comments from a local journal, which I found this journal quite restrictive and very narrow-minded in the previous papers I've submitted to them. But once again, they came back, they said, what is your intercoder reliability? And basically, why didn't you use software? So I'm rebutting that comment and saying, that's, giving numbers and things is not in the spirit of thematic analysis, particularly for that project, which had only 11 interviews. We wouldn't have done that. Yeah.
Don't you need at least 15 within a cell to do reliable quantitative?
Yeah, I mean,
Statistical listing.
There were 11, but qualitative, you can do a case study. If you're using that IPA method, you can use like 2 or 3. And you're doing such detailed analysis that,
IPA.
I think I don't know. I think I did it very superficially instead. I actually understand a little bit more.
What is it? Interpretive phenomenological analysis. Smith. Yeah. So it's looking more at the psychological, but it's a really detailed approach.
It's great. It's similar to thematic. But you kind of really spend time on detail.
Yeah, so this article talks a lot about this concept of validity, and it's interesting because they're actually talking about it in light of qualitative research. And typically we don't talk about validity, we talk about rigor and trustworthiness. But just to remind ourselves, it's about the quality of the research. It's about, are we really finding true findings that represent the population? How accurately are we measuring things? And it's linked to the qualitative concepts of credibility and transferability. So they talk a lot in this article about post-qualitative work and validity in a post-qualitative era. So it's been a highly debated topic in the qualitative field, and there really isn't any clarity about validity or credibility, transferability in relation to QDAS. So what is a valid study? What is a valid interpretation? Which I think links to what we've been talking about here, the subjectivity.
I think it goes back to that article that I presented at the last journal club as well on bricolage, and saying it's like for the reviewers or an examiner of a project or a reviewer of a paper, that how do you measure that this was a valid study, and in terms of, was this rigorous? And I think people feel far more comfortable if there is this like rubric that they can follow. So like QDAS provides some sort of like structure in terms of how it was done, and
recipe
that people understand, and they're like, oh, if I used in vivo or I used Atlas TI, someone who wasn't part of that project can be like, oh, okay, yes, I understand how that analysis is done. And I think that's often, like you were saying, that you wanted to use a software to show like a reviewer or show a journal that you know what you're doing. You've used a recognized method. And I think, people, it's easy to fall into that trap, I think.
Absolutely, Megan. I like that it links, and I like that our articles are all linking in the topics. I think that's so important that the bottom line is you've got to explain your methods really carefully and really thoroughly in a paper. So then they moved on in this article talking about qualitative research as practice, talking about Heidegger's theories on technology as a means to an end. It's a purpose of human activity, and our relationship to technology is something that we need to interrogate. So yes, it's a tool, but it can actually, it's operated by a human. So there's rational action by the researcher in terms of how that tool is used potentially. There's rational action in terms of how the software developers have put it together, and they're thinking around what is thematic analysis or what is qualitative research. Basically, you're kind of beholden to them and whatever they've thought, and have they put thought into the software that they've developed. So it's something to think about. So when using QDAS, researchers are unavoidably affected by how the software packages take up, present, and process data. So there's a predetermined notion of validity that those software developers have come up with.
I have a feeling that if I had continued with it, I managed to get through it, I was going to do it again the way that I know how. like the manual, you know, from web
Yeah.
document and then table and then yeah, because I was gonna have that feeling that now you're missing something.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I had that same feeling when I tried Atlas on a few projects a few years ago, where it's like I feel like maybe I'm not seeing the big picture. And I was getting very frustrated and kind of ended up trying to take it offline onto pen and paper just to check that what it was finding, what I was finding using that tool was similar to what I would have found on my own. Yeah, very tricky.
That's often not really the most interesting, you know. You know, it's one small part what comes up most often, you know, but sometimes the outliers is also where, you know, the learning comes in.
That's such an important point.
Yeah.
Yeah, because often then, yeah, this kind of software that's focusing on numbers and saturation.
Quantity over quality.
Yeah, saturation is also a very debated term. But this, you know, what's popping up most frequently, and then you miss the outliers that might actually hold such valuable information. Yeah. So I need to have that balance, I guess.
Because, you know, when you think about the research, if we're wanting research that is helpful to others, you know, you need a reasonable level of insightfulness, but most people know what's going to come up most often. You know, if you're working in that space, you know, and maybe there is some you know, value in actually understanding that other people feel or experience or think the same as you. I think that there is that element. But yeah, that seems to me a fairly limited outcome of your research.
Absolutely,
is to show you that you are not alone in your thoughts and feelings or experiences, that there needs to be something else.
And I always think of Joanne Neal's PhD, which was a narrative-based analysis, but people's stories of living with disability in a rural area, and she'd expected to find these doom and get to the hospital, and what she found was that they were talking far more about not having ID books, and that came out as a significant issue of not having an identity, not belonging.
Expect that
the disability was like, yeah, we've got a disability and we deal with it, but the ID book is the more important issue that stresses us, and that, yeah.
So
yeah,
there's an
not
example.
what she expected.
Well, you know, I think there's an example of where, like, doing it by the numbers is extremely valuable, because if enough people have that problem, then clearly it needs to be addressed and nobody was aware of it.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that's a counter argument to mine, which I think is absolutely, you know, it happens. But I think also, yeah, sometimes I think you state the obvious.
Yeah.
You know, like a head nod is for agreement. Like, yeah.
And sometimes it's what's not said as well. So sometimes it's really picking up on what isn't there. So, and that was powerful, Santo, in your study, I think, that, you know, you had very strong expectations of what you thought you were going to find and where the study was headed. And actually, no, it's gone in a completely different direction. Because when we paused and we put aside those assumptions, then we were able to see, okay, there's a whole story here, but it's not the story that we thought. Yeah.
I think that's also, like, in this thing about the numbers and stuff, there can be instances where, like I'm thinking about with Charmaine's data, where maybe there's like most of the interviews are saying one thing, and then you have this one interview that's saying something a bit different. And if you were to look at it in terms of numbers, you would dismiss that. But actually, then when you look at, okay, why is this one person saying this when the rest of these people are not saying this? And that becomes a really important part of the story as well.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking we need to do a follow-up journal club on this issue of saturation, which is also so debated. And, you know, it's upheld as, you know, something you should be going for in your data is saturation. And yet, as you're saying, Siobhan, sometimes that outlier is so important.
Yeah, you can't dismiss it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, so they're talking in this article about this notion of inter-rater reliability. So on some of these software programs, you can run a Cohen's kappa. And what it's suggesting, which is potentially quite dangerous, is an emphasis on reproduction rather than on a dynamic, subjective, interpretive process of coming to consensus. So that back and forth discussion of refinement. What are we really seeing? What's really going on in the data? And I think certainly, Sontal, with your project, you know, just coming together as a supervision team with you and chatting through over several hours, and then like, oh, the light bulb goes on. Okay, now we know what's really going on in the data. Is far more valuable than sitting and doing a Cohen's kappa and saying, okay, well, I used this software, I did Cohen's kappa, and we've got iterated reliability. That's a bit too simplistic. Yeah.
This comes back to that thing that we've spoken about before about insider and outsider perspectives, and you can have an insider, like for example with me and Charmaine, where Charmaine's a clinician and I'm not a clinician, and we've got very different perspectives sometimes on, you know, what's important and what someone is saying, but that's actually useful. The fact that we disagree and that we're not, you know, that we're not coding everything in exactly the same way is actually a good thing, because then we're helping one another pick up on things that we would have missed otherwise.
Absolutely. And you're ending up with a far more rigorous process because you've had these moments of disagreement and stopping and saying, okay, what does this mean? Why are we seeing things differently? What's going on? How do we merge the perspectives?
Yes.
Yeah. I love how everything's linking here.
Yeah, it is.
The methodological issues we're grappling with at the moment in projects. That's fantastic. So what these authors suggest is a shift from just the software and, you know, oh, I'm using in vivo, I'm using whatever, to how we interact with it and really interrogating. And that, Megan, what you were saying about that reflective practice. So what are we really dealing with here, and how are we using this tool to help us make sense of the data? But also, what are we trying to do with this data analysis process, and where are we headed? So thinking about how we interact, how the software mediates and restructures our relationship with the participants and with the audience. I thought that was a very important point, that often we're not really thinking about the audience or the participants. And are we really staying true to their stories? Or are we kind of twisting things because this is how the software is forcing us to analyze? So we need to critically reflect on the built-in structure, the built-in assumptions that those software developers have about what is valid, what is a valid interpretation, and then thinking about our own methodological positions. So again, that bricolage article was so useful in really interrogating the methodology and what am I doing and why am I doing it, and making informed decisions about the most appropriate way to do the analysis.
And what's the most appropriate for the research question or the project?
And the type of data that you have, because I really think that you're going to do different analysis depending on the type of data. The depth of the data, the richness, the type of questions, the aims, objectives, so kind of going back to the research question, back and forth, So then they talked about this reflective space, which was quite useful. So thinking about the methodological approach, so one's underlying ontological, epistemological assumptions. So what type of qualitative research are you doing, and what theories and philosophies are informing that? Then thinking about the validity and the structure of the QDAS, so the assumptions about what is counted as valid, and what have those software developers done in terms of setting up their system? What are their goals? I don't think I've ever thought about actually going and reading the background information about the program. Yes, you know, what were their intentions here? What do they think you can use it for, and how? And then thinking about the research context, so the design, the contextual factors, which I think is what we've just been talking about, the type of study, the richness of the data. So all of these aspects need to be considered and reflected on before one jumps into using software. But even if you are going to use it, while you're using it, really interrogating and maybe keeping that research journal, keeping very careful notes on what we're doing and why. Just talking about software, it's been interesting. I've been trying to use Rayon for several scoping reviews. And I know you've used that. And I've also found it quite restrictive, just because of the way that it's designed, and the kinds of things that you can do with it and things that it doesn't do, and getting a bit frustrated with that. So it was helpful initially for the initial blind coding between reviewers, but then we've actually moved offline, and using pen and paper or Excel spreadsheets and thinking a bit differently about how to use it. So a similar sort of thing, that I found it quite restrictive at times. Yeah. So there's a need for deliberate methodological decision making. The authors here advocated for a more holistic, deliberate, reflective process, and putting dialogue at the center of consensus formation. So really doing, Siobhan, what you were talking about doing with Charmaine, so coming together, thrashing out, talking about what are we seeing here, how is this working, what are we each doing, and how do we make sense of things. And I think we've done that very powerfully with other projects like the telepractice study, where there were quite a few debrief meetings of what are we dealing with, and are we happy with these themes, and what are we seeing, and then going back to the data to confirm the consensus we'd come to. Are we on the right track, refining that further? So not simple, hey?
No, but it actually was like relatively pleasant the whole way through, which I think was unusual. So yeah, it's nice.
It was, and it was also
Not
feeling our way kind of project, because there isn't a guidebook on how to do that kind of research where you're observing videos, making notes, and then trying to analyze it. So we were very much doing a sort of bricolage, but feeling our way in the dark. And it did work quite nicely in the end. I think it came together.
Yeah.
But these methodological papers are so valuable because there are so few methodological papers, and like what people grapple with and how they sort of resolved things. And
I suspect people are not honest about how to do.
No.
And I think it's because they're not allowed to be.
And you can't find those papers. They're not often that you find that people are honest and talk about sort of.
You know, it's that sort of Brene Brown like thing about, you know, don't give me the critic who isn't in the arena. You know, like if you just a reviewer criticizing, and you don't know what it's like to be on the ground. And I think the same applies to research. You know, you've got that's that insider thing too. You've got to actually kind of understand and also be aware that it's not the same. You know,
exactly.
You bring something different.
But I think, Rona, your point and Sonto's earlier point about, you know, people I think do feel very pressured to present something that they think is the way to do it.
Yes.
Or an acceptable method.
This sounds clever.
Or editors are going to like this. I mean, again, we're grappling, Sahba and I, with this story, with this particular journal. So they like doing something called literature control, which, if you Google it, does not exist. But I was asked to do it by reviewers on a previous paper in this journal, literature control. So they want, at the end of every theme, a section where you summarize and you compare it to the literature.
For every
theme.
And don't you sort of do that anyway?
But you do that sort of in the
you do that in the discussion, but so they just wanted,
yeah,
so they wanted at the end of every theme, and they call it literature control. And initially I was like, what is this? I've never heard. And I started Googling. I did it on the previous paper because I thought, well, okay, it is what you would do in the discussion. They just want it in a different place. But it's very anal.
I'm not blaming myself in discussion.
Exactly. But you know,
and they're all in this.
But I mean, you do that because this is how kids are taught to do like essays. I've mentioned this before. That appeal is you've got to have a point, you've got to have evidence, you've got to have explanation, you've got to have a loop back to the question or to the next topic. So I mean, that's how we write. We do. We give evidence and explanations, and the evidence is the literature, isn't it?
So it is.
But then sometimes we use our data as the evidence.
I suppose
you're supposed to use your data and the literature.
Yes, and I suppose also how You could write it in that way where you have sort of literature to back what you're seeing. But sometimes you keep it separate, like you keep your discussion and
yes, exactly.
argument and sort of backing literature in your discussion, and you keep your results just as the results.
So the dilemma comes in, do you fight that? Or do you just say, okay, we'll do it because then we'll get the work published?
How do you get within a word count though?
So it's just a paragraph they want added. It's not a lot.
Says.
Yeah, in my mind, I just see it as a rather naive approach to writing. That, it's kind of simplistic and naive, and some of the rest of us who are perhaps a bit more experienced with qualitative research know that you can do it a bit differently and in a more rich, interpretive kind of way in the discussion. I don't know. But yeah, again, what does one do? Do you fight it, or do you just say, okay, sure, I'll do it? It's like, it's not a big deal. In the end, I did it on the previous paper because, I recognize also this is not like an international Web of Science accredited journal. It's a little local journal. Like, okay, just do it.
She wants it like a master's essay.
Yeah. So, but there is that pressure to kind of conform, I guess. Yeah. So some solutions that they offered in this article to find validity in research process instead of the product, which I thought was interesting. So really, again, that bricolage article about explaining your methodological approach in a lot of detail. Communicate about the process, so make sure everybody in the team is on board, or else even if you're doing it just yourself, that you communicate in your methods section of your paper in a lot of detail what you've done and why. Form consensus by breaking a linear coding process. So what they were saying there is that often the software forces you to do all this coding before you stop and start engaging in consensus discussions. And so sometimes you need to actually stop at regular points along the way and have those debrief discussions, which I think, Siobhan, you've been doing with Charmaine, very regular discussions. What are we seeing? What are we doing? Instead of just everybody code and then at the end you have one discussion. Yeah. If it's not working, do something different or move outside the software. I really like that point. And Santo, I think you were saying earlier, it wasn't working, so you moved away. And that's okay. And even if you're doing paper-based analysis, sometimes it's not working and you need to try something different. So I tried Atlas just out of interest because I thought, I'd better use my last sabbatical, the last one I had, to kind of jack up my knowledge and my skills, and let's try and see if I can learn Atlas and try it out. And tried it, wasn't so keen. But if I needed to use it for a particular project in future, I might. Disagreements should not be treated as a threat to validity, but as a constructive starting point to initiate helpful conversation and in-depth reflection. So I think that's really lovely as well, that this consensus, this discussion coming together is so important. And that even if you're disagreeing, that's a good thing because it strengthens the validity and it means you're coming out with a more rigorous product in the end. And you want a collaborative environment where people feel they're able to talk about that, talk about the project, talk about what they're seeing. I think for me, what's been so meaningful this year is meeting with some of my PhDs. So Santo, you're one of them. Cynthia was another one. And then with you, Megan, around your study and thrashing out what are we really seeing in the data and having hours-long discussions around it.
And I like it when people see different things, when you have those debates and discussions. It's like I don't find it threatening at all if someone's got a differing opinion to what I'm seeing, because then it makes me really critically think about my argument or why I'm seeing that and whether I agree or still disagree. And if I still disagree, to really think about my argument and justifying why I want it makes
which aspects you have to defend,
which enriches your data and as you as a academic and as a researcher. Because I often think of you and Tina being supervisors and
Yes.
on our projects,
Very different opinions sometimes.
you think so differently, and it is that insider outsider perspective and your training and backgrounds, and
Yeah.
but I've so valued the differing opinions because it's made me really have to think about my data
Yeah.
or my argument. Yeah, I think it's helpful if people don't just see the same thing.
Yeah, and I think what you were saying about that being open to discussions and being open to different views. And I think, Sondra, that was so powerful with your study that initially you were quite resistant to, but this is not what I was supposed to be doing. And then once you got over that hurdle, you were able to actually open up to a whole new world of, wow, this is a really meaningful project. It's completely different to what I initially thought it would be. So that openness and collaboration and being receptive to discussions. So just to finish off, I thought it would be interesting just to go back to that article on the Twitter and the 4 different softwares that they used. So they were talking about choosing a suitable QDAS that dovetails with your focus. And what they suggested, obviously this is specifically in relation to Twitter, but Atlas accommodates scholars focusing on wrangling unstructured data for personal meaning making. Max QDA is good for mixed methods. QDA minor is very easy to use, suits a highly efficient implementation of methods. And Vivo supports relatively rapid analysis. So it was quite interesting to see how the different programs could be used for different purposes. I don't know if this was particularly helpful to me, but just to see that one does need to think a little bit about what you're picking. I guess in our context, it's very much restricted by what licenses you have access to. I think Deduce is free, is it not? Is there a license?
I'm working on, I think Charmaine's within their unit, they've got her an access or something, and then I'm her access. So she's just added me as a collaborator on her access. So I haven't had to, I don't think it's free. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's typically, I think it's just because Charmaine's supervisor has used Deduce before and really likes Deduce and is happy with it. And so they organized a license for her. And then I've been working through her license.
Yeah, so WITS typically has the Atlas license. That's the one that they usually subscribe to. Where did you do in Vivo? Was it through WITS?
It was through WITS. I remember Honey attended us all. It was public health.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's just
maybe it's public health.
Maybe it's just that faculty. But I remember that they seem to have some link to WITS as well. Because I mean, I can't imagine them offering training if they're not offering access to the.
I checked this year a few months ago, 2-3 months ago, when I wanted to use it. Because I thought maybe if I use the premium one, then maybe I'll get more out of it. Emailed Silo put me through, I don't know if the ICT department, but yeah, it wasn't on the list.
So you just use the free version. Yeah, Atlas, I had to organize a license, but then it expired as well. So they only give you a license for a very short time. So I had to kind of download everything very quickly so that I had.
And did you have to pay initially for
Atlas? No, I got it through the library people here. Yeah, but then what was very frustrating was when I downloaded documents off Atlas, it would cut off the quotes. So it would give you half a quote, and so you'd still have to go and search in the documents that you had for the full quote. So I really wasn't.
And also, how do you handle like translations? Because I think at the very end you need it helped having the direct words that we used, just to refer back. So now when everything is on the system and you only have access to the English.
Yeah, that is a good point. Yeah. So I hope that this has been thought-provoking. I guess, yeah, one should just really interrogate very thoroughly what one is doing with the software and how it's helping you or how you're using it in your project. And don't be scared to move away from it when you need to, if you need to. Yeah, and just really think about what is the software doing to your analysis and your interpretive lens. Is it forcing you in a particular direction, which may not be the best direction that you need to go into for the project? Yeah, so thanks everyone.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, and nice how it links with all our other journal clubs that we've done so far.
I like that we focus